Right. Well, good evening to everybody and welcome to Rasha Christi Bunker. And it's good to be with you. We're just waiting for our music to, which is great, to come to an end. Yes, there we go. Thank you very much. Well, good evening to everybody and welcome to Rasha Christi Bunker. And it's good to be with you. Just waiting for our music to, which is great, come to an end. Yes, there we go. Thank you very much. Well, good evening to everybody and welcome to Rasha Christi Bunker. Andre. It's good to be with you. We're off now. Sorry. How are we doing now? Okay. To our listeners, sorry for that glitch. I was running YouTube and Zoom at the same time. And so sorry about that crazy start to our channel. I do apologize for that. But welcome and good evening to Rasha Christi Bunker. Who is Rasha Christi? We're a student campus ministry and organization that began in the US. We now have 5 chapters here in South Africa. And the goal and the purpose of Rasha Christi is to train and equip Christians on campus to be able to understand their faith, better understand their faith, and importantly, to be able to answer the questions and the objections that are often leveled against Christianity, to be more persuasive in our witness, and to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ in a winsome and a persuasive way. We have been reduced to doing Rasha Christi Bunker because of the current pandemic, and so we are using this platform to communicate with folks. And do feel free to subscribe to our channel and check out videos we've done in the previous weeks. Last week, we had Dr. Simpson speaking to us about the very important subject of economics and the two major views, socialism versus kind of free market economics. And so I encourage you to look at that. You can support us as well. We are trying to raise support as a ministry. We are a non-profit organization. So please do check out below the YouTube channel thing, the description. There is a link there for donations. And in addition to that, with our speaker this evening, we've also put in the description a link to a very, very well put together video on the subject we're going to speak on this evening, which you can revisit to recap some of the material and also forward that on to other people for their consideration. So do check that out. As far as next week goes, we have our speaker for next week will be Rogers Atemwembere. I'm not sure I got that name right. He is a scholar from Uganda, an expert in cults and new religious movements, and he will be speaking on traditional African religions and the prosperity gospel. So that's for next week. All right. Well, this evening, we're very privileged to have an outstanding guest speaker for us and a good friend of mine that I've had the privilege of knowing for a number of years, Dr. Joe Bergeron. Dr. Joe Bergeron is a practicing a medical doctor who lives in the United States. And I met him a number of years ago, and he came and spoke at the National Conference on Christian Apologetics in Charlotte a few years ago. And he has worked with a number of well-known Christian scholars, writers, and experts, including Dr. Gary Habermas. And in some areas, Gary Habermas, I know, would consult Dr. Bergeron because he knows more about some of these issues. So in addition to the subject this evening, the crucifixion, Dr. Bergeron actually has done a lot of work on some other very interesting subjects, which we hope to hear from him more from him on those. But this evening, we shall be diving into what is part of the centerpiece of the Christian faith. That is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In order for there to be a resurrection, there had to be a man who was dead. And Jesus Christ was crucified. And that's what the Bible teaches. And that's what the church has believed for centuries. And indeed, it's an interesting thing to me that the skeptics typically don't take issue with the crucifixion of Christ. Muslims take issue with the crucifixion of Christ. The skeptic typically has issues with the resurrection. But certainly the subject of the resurrection is one of historical importance. And certainly Dr. Bergeron is going to look at this in a way perhaps more deeper than you've ever considered. And at the same time, the consequences of Jesus's death is theologically significant and eternally significant for those of us who believe in the work of Jesus Christ. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Bergeron here, who's an expert on the subject and has written some medical and academic papers on the subject. And so good evening, Dr. Bergeron, and welcome to our Rosh Christi Bunker in South Africa.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to be with you, and I want to say publicly that your encouragement, Simon, has meant a lot to me in years gone by and really kept me going and kept me working on the book, which was a years in progress effort that was a really very difficult task, and your encouragement meant a lot to me, so I want to say that publicly. Here's the book. I'm not trying to sell the book. I don't make any money from the sales of the book. I donated the proceeds to Radio Christi, actually. And there's not a lot of money in book publishing, at least in this sort of thing, at least for me anyway. So I'm not leaving my day job to become an author. The importance, however, of the book is the book is unusual among writings of physicians in that I wrote the book. I didn't really realize it till I was finished that I wrote it as if I was writing a summary for a court deposition, because I've done a lot of that type of work in my career. So as I looked at the historical content, what was driving the events of the day, who were the key players, why was it so important for the Jewish leaders to kill Jesus, and then go into a detailed discussion of the nuts and bolts of how crucifixion occurred, what the physiological effects of that kind of torture would be, discussing the various hypotheses of how Jesus died, because the mechanism of death, what we would commonly call the cause of death, is not clear. There is no injury to vital organs or structures. So physicians there has not been a consensus among physicians as to how Jesus actually died. And so I address a great deal of content toward that, and then discuss the resurrection of Jesus, not from the physical aspect, but rather from critical scholars who have sought to propose hallucination hypothesis, which is a medical explanation for what the disciples believed, and that really has not come under medical scrutiny. The article that Dr. Habermas and I collaborated on, I think, is the first work, at least that I'm aware of, that took that to task in detail. So I won't talk specifically about the historical things. I think most people know that Jesus was a historical figure. That's really not contested among historical scholars, and that he was executed. I'll talk about Roman crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was the most severe form of execution used by the Romans, beginning in about 300 BC till about 300 AD. Now, the Romans would have crucified hundreds of thousands of people over those centuries because they had a committed belief to capital punishment and exercised it vigorously. For example, in the Spartacus rebellion in 70 BC, 6,000 slaves or insurgents were executed by crucifixion along the Appian Way, which is a Roman highway about 120 kilometers from Capua to Rome. That's a lot of people. And you know that was meant to send a public message that is, don't mess with the Roman military because it won't end well for you. So it was commonly employed, but it was considered, how to say it, obscene by the Romans Roman citizens would not be crucified. It was for political insurgents, non-Roman citizen felons, and runaway slaves. What would happen was the convicted felon would be beaten. The whip was called a flagellum or flagrum, which had leather strips with dumbbell pieces of lead sewn into the end that would act as cutting implements, and they would be scourged from head to toe. The scourging itself would take people close to death. The historian Eusebius said that onlookers would marvel at seeing the veins, arteries, and internal organs being exposed by the beating. So the philosopher Seneca said that people would have many reasons to die before ever making it to the cross. So it was a brutal sort of beating that occurred. The clothes would be taken from the victim. They would have a plaque they would have to carry called the Titulus Crucis. Jesus' title of the cross said King of the Jews. People know that, but every convicted felon would have to carry a plaque with their capital crimes on it to the crucifixion site. They would carry the horizontal section of the cross. The cross was called a tau cross, at least in Jesus' time, that was commonly employed. And so what there was a vertical structure called the stipes, and the patibulum, the horizontal structure, would be carried by the convicted felon. Their arms would be nailed, and then Roman soldiers would lift them up and place them, the horizontal section with the person nailed to it, on top of the vertical section by a mortise and tenon coupling. Then the feet would be nailed to the vertical section. So to do this, it had to be something that could be easily done, because the soldiers may have to crucify many people. Josephus, who was an eyewitness of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, said that there were hundreds of people in a day crucified. So you can understand that it had to be something that they could do quickly and easily. So what you have is Roman soldiers lifting someone onto the vertical section of the cross that would be about 6 to 8 feet tall, and the victim would be eye to eye with his executioners. So it wasn't in a high cross. The high cross, or crux sublimis, could be used on occasion, but it would be for politically important people, which Jesus wouldn't qualify for in the Roman mind. So that's what happened to get to the cross itself. As I said, crucifixion did not have any injury or direct injury to vital organs. So people would be left on the cross until they died. And that could take days. There are literary references to crucifixion lasting up to 7 days. So you can understand how horrible that would be. Several people have asked me, did anyone ever survive crucifixion? Is there any record of that? And there is one. Josephus, as I said, the Jewish historian who defected and became a Roman citizen and wrote his histories of the Jewish wars, saw 3 of his friends being crucified, and he was able to get a stay of execution from the emperor and have them taken down. 2 of them died anyway. One of them was nursed back to health. Now, and the reason the 2 died anyway, and I wasn't there, but I can just tell you that the body can only take so much physiological insult, and that as an individual is succumbing into shock, even if you take a person in severe shock and put them in an ICU unit and restore their blood chemistries and vital signs, they'll die anyway because of the biochemical effects of oxygen deprivation that occur with decreased blood circulation from shock. So, and we should understand that Roman military discipline was severe. If you nodded off and fell asleep while you were on watch, you were going to be beaten to death. For someone to escape crucifixion would mean death for the crucifixion team, which would be a centurion and a group of soldiers working with him. When Jesus was on the cross, he said, I thirst. And that wasn't normal thirst. That was the thirst that occurs with shock blood loss. And there are literary descriptions of people being crucified, and the kind of thirst that they experience would be maddening. The reason is because the thirst isn't from a dry mouth, that we all get. But the thirst is stimulated from central mechanisms. The arteries have pressure sensors called baroreceptors. If they sense that blood volume is diminished, they start stimulating the brain. There's a hormone system in your kidneys, the renin-angiotensin system, that will also detect fluid, diminished circulating blood volume. Both of those will start stimulating the brain and saying to your brain, not me to add human characteristics to these kind of physiological mechanisms, but they start saying to the brain, you better start drinking something quickly. It's a central stimulation of the brain by two physiological mechanisms. It's very different from the normal thirst that we all experience. So when Jesus said, I thirst, it would have been like a scream. It would have been a maddening sort of thing. And I think that's something that's important to me, but maybe not talked about enough. I think it's Luke chapter 24, where Luke describes Jesus sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'll have to be honest with you, I never thought, that doesn't happen, right? I never got that. The problem is it really does happen. And I cite several cases in the book, a couple of them that were well studied, including hospital admission, blood chemistries, and biopsy studies. And they generally occur in response to anxiety. That's called hematidrosis, or sweating blood. Now, Jesus had what we would call a single episode psychogenic hematidrosis. There are a few people around that have these occurrences periodically, and it's usually treated by medications that treat anxiety. But people that have a single episode, that's not common. There are only a handful of reported cases, and those are they're always in anticipation of injury, and almost always prior to execution. So Jesus understood. He would have seen people crucified. He understood what was going to happen. And then I think on a spiritual level, understanding that he would be bearing the sins of the world, I think weighed on his mind in a way that maybe is underappreciated also. How Jesus died, the cause of death was crucifixion. And in medical language, when we're talking about how someone died physiologically, we're talking about the mechanism of death. The mechanism of death, as I said previously, there was not a consensus about it because there's not a clear indication of how someone died by crucifixion. It's not like a firing squad. Someone would hang on the cross until they died, and the external observer, particularly not a medical person, wouldn't necessarily know how they were dying. So that's led to a lot of speculation. The first thing I ever heard was that Jesus' heart burst due to emotional agony. Well, that just doesn't happen. But those sorts of explanations started to come into literature and popularity beginning, I think, in the 1300s with St. Bridget of Sweden. And then some medical writers have adopted the similar position. But the primary reason someone's heart muscle ruptures is from a heart attack. And it usually doesn't occur immediately. It usually takes a day or two to occur. It can occur in an acute heart attack, but for that to happen, the muscles of the heart would have to develop a hematoma or blood clot within the muscles and separate the blood fibers or the muscle fibers and cause them to rupture. So it's a rare sort of occurrence. And in modern cardiac care, it's very, very uncommon. So it's just not a logical explanation in a healthy young man to have died from cardiac rupture from emotional stress. That's just not it's untenable. Now, probably the most common one, I don't know how many sermons I've heard where the pastor will say, "Oh, Jesus suffocated." Now, that sort of explanation came primarily, it was popularized by the French surgeon Pierre Barbet in his book, A Doctor at Calvary. Now, Dr. Barbet was aware of the writings of a Czechoslovakian surgeon named Hynek and a French surgeon named Lebec, and they were aware of suspension torture in the Austro-Hungarian War, where people would be tortured by suspending them with their arms directly overhead, with their feet unsupported. And people appeared to suffocate in that sort of torture. Now, suffocation means interruption of the respiratory apparatus. Asphyxiation means the effect of oxygen deprivation, which can occur with suffocation. Now, the suspension torture was part of the Nazi penal code. So the Nazis used this as a punishment in the concentration camps. And Dr. Barbet, not only aware of the writings of Lebec and Hynek, but he had been told an eyewitness account of someone who had been murdered essentially by suspension torture, where the individual was suspended, and over a process of about 3 hours, they turned blue and died. They appeared to suffocate. And so he presumed that was the mechanism of death for Jesus and for people that were crucified. And then he also studied the Shroud of Turin, and he looked at the blood flow patterns on the arms of the man of the Shroud of Turin, and he thought, oh, they bifurcate. That must mean that he was changing positions on the cross. And so he had to pull up to breathe. And you've probably heard these kind of explanations if you have interest in them. So it must mean that people had to pull up in order to breathe while they were on the cross, but they eventually suffocated. That of course doesn't hold water. It has logical problems on several levels. To begin with, suspension torture and crucifixion are not the same thing. They're not analogous to each other. The being supported with your hands over your head, and they would even put weights on the feet, would cause an extraction force on the muscles that attach your shoulder blade to your chest wall, and it would expand your chest wall. And suffocation can be explained in the context of suspension torture, but in crucifixion, the legs were supported by nails, and the arms were outstretched at the side. And people could last on the cross for days. Well, if you're suffocating and you've been beaten close to death before you ever got there, you're not going to survive. If you have to push up every time you take a breath and you're close to death already, you're going to die very fast. So that people could last for several days on the cross is inconsistent, or it's contradictory to the idea that people suffocated on the cross. Now, Jesus was talking to the people that were crucified with him the same day, talked to his mother. You can't really hold a conversation if you're suffocating. So how does that work? And then there have been reenactment studies. I think the most notable ones were by Dr. Frederick Zugby, where he actually took subjects and put them on a cross. But there's a picture of him doing that with a young man in his book, which I think is his son. So I've threatened to redo that experiment with my children. But he put these young, healthy people on a cross, and their arms hurt. They didn't like it. They didn't have any trouble bleeding. And he monitored their vital signs and blood gases, blood oxygen exchange. It was not impaired. And it was also interesting that they couldn't pull themselves or push themselves up on the cross anyway. They were physically unable to do that. Now, if you think about it, if I'm talking too long, Simon, you reel me in here. But if your arms are outstretched like that, the primary flexor of your arm is your biceps muscle. So if you do this, you place it at an extreme. It does best here when this is how you lift weights, right? You stretch the muscle as far as it can be stretched. The molecular way that muscles contract is placed at a disadvantage. They're pulled apart. It's at a mechanical disadvantage, and you need to supinate the forearm to have the biceps be at its strongest point. So if you pronate it, extend your arm, you've placed it at the absolute worst mechanical position for this muscle to contract, and you can't turn your arms to be able to contract if there's a nail through it. So the idea that someone could pull up, it's really hard to think of as a logical explanation for movement on the cross. I don't think anybody could move on the cross, and that would be supported by just kind of the logical inspection of the mechanics of it and the reconstruction studies. Now, the nail, if you put a nail through the palm of your hand here, it would pull out with about 100 pounds of force that way. But if you took your ring finger and bent it down as far as you could onto the bottom of the crease, the vertical crease on your palm, and put a nail through there, then it would go through your wrist bones and create a stable fusion that would withstand 240 pounds. I don't know how many kilograms that is. I'm sorry, I'm speaking American English. But 240 pounds of extraction force, which would be very stable. And it would do so without breaking the bones in the wrist. Now, here's the quirky mind of a physician. Dr. Barbet took 12 freshly amputated arms, and he did that to them. Put a nail through there. And there's a picture of the x-ray in my book. So he did his own experiment to prove his point. So a nail could be placed through the wrist bones, not through the center of the palm, and cause a very stable fixation. Nails were most commonly used. Now, what about the feet? The what's called the Proto-Evangelium, Genesis 3:15. God speaks to the serpent, Satan, and he says, the offspring of the woman will crush your head and you'll bruise his heel. There's only been 2 archaeological finds of crucifixion victims. The reason for that is that victims were left on the cross until their remains were eaten by scavenging animals. So there's only been 2 cases. One case was in Jerusalem, found in Jerusalem, is thought to be dated to the early part of the 1st century. The second find was in northeast Italy. During the Roman period, it couldn't be dated because the bones were in such poor condition. But obviously the Roman period, it was a male. And the heel, the nail was driven through the calcaneus, the heel bone. So if you walk on your heels, you're walking on your calcaneus bone. And what it appears is, from the only archaeological evidence we have, is that the nail was driven, if your ankle's kind of like your hand, was driven from the outside through the calcaneus into the wood, and there would be placed a piece of wood that would act as sort of a flashing, a washer or something that would in effect enlarge the head of the nail so it couldn't be pried off. The find in Jerusalem was very clear crucifixion remains because the nail was still in the heel, but it had bent. So the nail couldn't be extracted from the heel for reuse. So they had a very excellent specimen. Now, so if they couldn't get the nail out, how'd they get the foot off the cross, you may ask? They amputated the foot. There were cut marks on the calcaneus bone, part of the ankle joint. So the soldiers had amputated the foot to get the body off the cross with that individual. The remains of someone that had been crucified could be requested from legal authorities and given a proper burial, but it was not common, obviously. I talked about the rupture of the heart, and I talked about suffocation. The way Jesus died was by traumatic hemorrhagic shock, specifically the effects of diminished blood loss from tissue injury. He was beaten, as I said, from head to toe with a flagrum with scourge marks all over his body. It's often overlooked that he was beaten before he got to the Romans. And so he was beaten. He had a mock trial at the home of Caiaphas and Annas, which was thought to be a multi-generational mansion that they lived in, and he was beaten there. The Jews had lost capital authority by that time, but corporal authority, they could beat you as much as they wanted to. And they would limit stripes to 39 or 40 minus 1 was the limit that they could do. So you'll understand that they would have given him a good thrashing before he got to the Romans. Then he was beaten there. Now, you know that there was a particular ire among the Roman soldiers. They put a crown on him. They gave him a mock scepter. They hit him with it. And then they scourged him. So he was severely beaten by the time he's asked to carry the horizontal section of the cross to the crucifixion site. Estimated about 60 pounds, or I'm not sure what that is, 25 kilograms or something like that. He couldn't do it. So he would have been expected to carry that to the crucifixion site, but instead he just couldn't do it, and they had to enlist the assistance of a bystander to carry it for him, because of course a Roman wouldn't do that. The symptoms, the initial symptoms of shock would be confusion, lightheadedness, feeling sweaty and clammy, heart palpitations, and so forth. As you progress into shock, you start to develop biochemical effects from decreased blood perfusion of tissue. So the tissues are not getting enough blood supply, so they start dying, and they started emitting inflammatory chemicals, and the chemistry starts to become acidic. There's a shift in the pH, so acidemia develops. So you have this occurrence now. There's a complication of shock called trauma-induced coagulopathy, and there are 3 inciting factors for that. One is tissue injury and bleeding. Well, Jesus qualified for that as much as anybody. I mean, his entire body was beaten and scourged, and he would have had extensive bleeding from that. Hypothermia, or decreased core body temperature. Now you think about it. He's naked on the cross. His blood vessels are constricting because his blood volume is diminished. He's clammy and sweaty. And we know that the temperature was cold that day because Peter, who was following Jesus after the arrest, went and stood by soldiers to warm himself on a fire. He famously denied Jesus, afraid for his own life, but he lost that fear because he was cold and he wanted to stand by a fire. So we know it was cold that day, and temperatures vary in Jerusalem in the first week in April, but can get as cold as 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know what that is. Maybe 1 degree Celsius, but I don't know what it is.
Something like that, yeah.
So it was cold that day. So the three factors are tissue injury, blood loss, hypothermia, and acidemia, and all those things were present. Now, when that complication starts to occur, the blood starts losing its ability to clot, and that is just a very ominous situation. About 25%, I'm told, of patients that present to trauma units may present with coagulation issues, and it markedly increases their risk of death. It's difficult to control. The way that a trauma unit would control that would be by transfusion of blood products. Well, they didn't have those back then. You can understand. And so what happens is it creates a snowball effect. Well, it's a positive feedback loop where shock creates more shock. And as coagulopathy starts to develop, it will continue to keep going, and the blood will lose its ability to clot. Now, Jesus died in 6 hours. I think Mark says that he was crucified at 9 a.m. John says he was crucified at noon. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say he died at 3 o'clock. I think that's right. So it's 3 to 6 hours. He's on the cross. Now, this is a method of crucifixion, of execution that could last for days. So here he is. He dies in a few hours. People, even Pilate was surprised by that. So what was happening to him? Something was happening in his body that wasn't happening to the other people. That's why he was dead when they came to check the bodies, because they were going to break their legs. The Jews had asked that his body be taken down because it was the day before the Sabbath during the Passover week. So it was a special Sabbath for them. But by the time they got to Jesus, they saw that he was dead. Do you think they could pronounce death? I think they could. I think they were experienced. But again, thinking about the austerity of Roman military discipline, there's no way they're going to let his body be taken down with even a prospect of him being alive. So they ram a spear into his side. Now, they knew how to deliver a death blow. And so it's traditionally thought that the death blow was through the right side. The right side of the heart is a lower pressure system and be more likely to have a reservoir of blood at the point of death. And the description is that John, and he's redundant about it. He says, I was there, I saw this, and water and blood came out. Now, beating the chest wall can cause injury to the lung itself, can cause the lung to collapse, and can cause fluid to develop in the chest cavity. That fluid, unless there's bleeding associated with it, will be clear. And so it's going to look like water to a casual observer. So when there's a puncture site, what they're going to see is something that looks like water. When it enters the heart, the blood will mix with the pericardial effusion and look like blood. So they'll have the appearance of two separate fluids emanating from the chest wound. So John's description is easily understandable from a medical standpoint, but it was thought to be, people didn't understand that. Origen thought it was a miraculous sign, but we understand that was something easily explainable. Some people think Jesus died from the fatal stab wound. Well, and the premise being, dead bodies don't bleed. But remember, it seems likely that Jesus' blood had lost its ability to clot. Secondly, a large volume of blood, as would be in the right chamber of the heart, could be unstable, reliquefy anyway. The fact that there was blood emanating from that chest wound doesn't mean he was alive at that moment. And I, for one, give credence to the Roman soldiers who pronounced him dead. Dr. Barbet thought that, they're going to break the legs so that they would suffocate more. The Bible doesn't really give us an indication of that. What it says is that the command was given to break their legs and take the bodies down. Not break the legs and let's stand around and watch. Let's see what happens. See if they die quicker. No. Why they would break the legs, it's really not clear. The immediate effect would be, of course, increased torture, bleeding. Breaking long bones can cause fat lobules to enter the circulation. They're called fat emboli. If those occur, they can cause death. So there'd be different reasons for that. But we don't have a good clue from the biblical narrative about a physiological mechanism why they would break the legs. To say that they broke them to watch them suffocate is not consistent with the biblical narrative either. It's kind of an a priori conclusion that Dr. Barbet made. And Dr. Barbet's book is excellent in many respects. It's a classic, but there's logical problems with the suffocation idea. But that's where the popularization of that came from. But really, in modern thinking, traumatic hemorrhagic shock, or Dr. Zuckerby, who wrote his excellent book, Crucifixion of Jesus, a Forensic Inquiry, named the cause of death as crucifixion, complicated by cardiac and respiratory failure from traumatic hemorrhagic shock. And that's how Jesus died. Now, what's the importance of this kind of discussion, you may ask? It's interesting to talk about. The thing about it is that when we look at it and we give a medical analysis to it, and we can say, oh my gosh, we can understand this all. It all makes sense medically. Then we can look at the descriptions in the gospel narratives and say it's consistent with modern medical understanding, and that's intrinsic evidence of their authenticity. And I think that's the importance of this kind of study. And Jesus himself, and I say this, I think, to get theological for a moment, if you let me. Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover Seder, and he said, this cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And I think he was telling us, at least how I read it, he was telling us his mechanism of death, that he was going to bleed to death. And that's, I think, consistent with the medical analysis of the narratives. Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Bergeron, thank you very much for that. I'm pretty confident that nobody has heard as detailed a exposition of these the biblical accounts that we have, plus also combined with your medical knowledge of trauma and these kinds of things. I for many years had heard preached that Jesus he suffocated on the cross, and that was the view that I had heard. And when I heard you present your material, I'm more convinced now of the arguments that you're making, and I just think that it's an important thing for us to come to grips with what Jesus. Well, not that we could really do that unless we went through something like that ourselves, but to try and appreciate what Christ went through on the cross, and then to see the merit of the biblical account in light of the medical knowledge we now have that might not have been available to people, or certainly wasn't available to people back then, or wasn't even available to people up until a couple of 100 years ago. So that is fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
It's funny because I took a couple of years to write the medical journal article, and then a couple of years with an article of Dr. Habermas, and then 3+ years with the book and so forth. But after I did the medical study, and then I looked at, I think it's Matthew chapter 26, I thought, oh my God, he told us. He told us he was going to die from blood loss. He was going to bleed to death. That's what the scriptures teach us. And so it all just really makes sense. And so I think from that standpoint, it means a lot to me. I don't, people have asked me how the study affects me. But it affects me in a couple of ways. One is that I'm more convinced now than ever that what I believe is true. And then this may sound odd, but when I listen to songs about the blood of Jesus and those kind of things, it's hard for me to listen to them because my mind goes to his blood chemistry was deranged. He bled to death because his blood couldn't clot anymore. It's a hard thing to contemplate, that level of torture to derange someone's chemistry. But death was inevitable and became rapid in a way that was unusual. Do we want to talk about hallucination? I don't. No, talk for 45 minutes already.
Yes, no, that's great. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And like I said to you, we'll keep an eye out for your book, because I know the book has a lot of illustrations on there. You talked about mortise and tenon joinery. Most people don't know what a mortise and tenon joint is. I'm a carpenter, so I do. And so it's good to see some of the pictures and the images there. But we can get our audience to go and look for that as well. But I see we've got some questions coming in now from YouTube. So we'll see if we can go to some of these. So I'm just going to pull that up here. We're kind of interfacing with WhatsApp here now as well. So we have a question here. So in light of what you've just presented, what is your response to swoon theory trying to explain Jesus' crucifixion? Is it highly unlikely? This is obviously one of the theories that's out there. It's called the swoon theory. Would you be able to respond in light of this to the swoon theory?
Well, my favorite sentence in my book, my favorite sentence is I said, the swoon theory is balderdash.
Okay.
It's not possible. It's not possible. Like I said, if you were a Roman soldier and you let someone escape death, you were going to die yourself. Mm-hmm. And there's no, they knew he was dead. Why'd they put a spear into his chest? It wasn't for poetic reasons. They just were not going to let the body down without unequivocally assuring that he was dead. No ifs, ands, or buts, 100%. And so, that's just not, it's just not possible. And like I said, there's no literary evidence to suggest anyone that completed crucifixion ever survived it.
Yes.
There's literary evidence, the Annals of Tacitus, that it was well known, and even in his Roman historical record, that Jesus suffered the supreme penalty, or which meant crucifixion, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So even history by a Roman scholar, which would not have been friendly to Christianity in any way, documented that Jesus died by crucifixion under Pilate's jurisdiction. And then when we look at the medical facts, like I said, the friends of Josephus, even they were taken down from the cross. 3 of them, 2 of them died anyway, because the body, when it starts to succumb to shock, if it's not rapidly corrected, it'll just keep going anyway. Okay. And even if someone's placed in ICU and their chemistry and everything's corrected, they'll still die.
Okay, so just maybe just to reinforce that this what you call as a cascading medical scenario. If somebody, for example, is involved in a car accident, or in South Africa we call it an accident, you guys call it a car wreck, such that the trauma is of a particular kind, the cascading effect is such that even our best medical folks are going to have a real problem to prevent that person, stop that person from dying, because it kind of keeps doubling down on itself. Is that what this cascading effect is like?
It can be like that, yes, because shock can start to develop at 10% blood loss. I think I say in the book, if you lose about 40% of your blood volume, your blood pressure will drop to zero. Circulating blood volume is about 5 liters, I believe. So it's the critical thing for trauma team at the site of a motor vehicle accident or whatever is to control bleeding and stabilize vital signs and get them to appropriate care.
Okay. We have a question here from Rudy de Beer. In your opinion, what was the reason why the shoulders would break the legs of the victim if it was not to hasten death? Was it to just increase the torture? So you mentioned, for example, the question of the Roman soldiers breaking the legs. Do we have any indication as to why they might do that? Was it just to increase the level of agony and pain? Or maybe through their experience, they realized, they might not know, but maybe it did accelerate death for other reasons?
I would suppose that it accelerated death in some way because they were doing it. And the crucifixion remains that were found in Jerusalem that I mentioned did in fact have broken legs, tibia and fibula. Okay. The biblical narrative doesn't tell us. It doesn't even give us a clue. It just says the order was given to break the legs and take the bodies down. What does that mean? It doesn't mean break the legs so they can now suffocate and take them down after that. So I don't know. It can have to do with trauma and the mechanisms of fat emboli and things that I mentioned previously. Probably it was for torture, additional torture and bleeding. That would be my take on it. Okay. And so they couldn't walk away.
Yes, so they couldn't walk away. Yes, and of course, there's an interesting that ties into the prophecy of Jesus not having a bone broken, which I find interesting as well. So, okay, so that's it. I've also, for example, that's often mentioned the breaking of the legs, and but it's interesting to see why they would use that. Now, I've always thought it would have been strange for them to break somebody's legs if they were strung up really high, because in order for you to break somebody's legs, you're going to have to use a pretty hefty, blunt instrument of some kind to swing by hand, maybe kind of something like equating to an axe handle or something that you would. So that would indicate that Jesus would have, and these victims would have been lower down, because if they were high up, how would you administer the blow? And your argument at the beginning was that Jesus was probably crucified on a fairly low T-shaped cross, yes, pretty much looking his executioners in the eyes. And if they were going to break legs, the guys are going to be at that level for you to swing that bat. Yeah.
I think in Mel Gibson's movie, it shows a soldier taking something that looks like a sledgehammer and taking a running start and then swinging to break the legs of the victims. And I think that's accurate because not whatever instrument they used, but it would have had to have been something like that, because the broken legs in the find in Jerusalem had two different types of fractures. The legs were affixed parallel to each other. The hips were rotated to the right, and the feet were parallel with the nails through both heels on the front of the cross in that victim. And one of the legs had kind of a transverse fracture through the leg. The other one had what's called a spiral fracture that goes through the leg like a spiral. I think that would be a higher force impact. So if you're having someone, at least in that victim, we only have two, but in that victim, that's probably how they were broken, by some sort of, significant blunt instrument with a high force. Now, the crucifixion find in Rome only had the heel punctured. No other bones were broken.
Okay. The next question. Okay, I'm looking at you. Sorry, I'm just communicating here with my tech guy. Yeah. You have discussed the crucifixion. We do have a follow-up to, you did mention it briefly there, but what is your take on the hallucination theory from a medical point of view?
Well, and I sent you that article with Dr. Habermas, and I would encourage you and your group to study that, and we can maybe have another meeting. But initially, a hallucination, when you read the writing of these people, the so-called critical scholars that would propose these sorts of things, they will say, and they're not medical people, they will say, oh, they were hallucinating, and full stop, and they stop their argument at that point. But hallucinations are not a diagnosis. They are a symptom of something happening to that patient. And it generally will fit in three categories. One would be a biophysiological problem where there's a malfunction of the brain, a brain tumor, something like that. One would be a chemical issue, maybe or psychobiochemical, we would call it. That'd be something like the DTs for an alcoholic with delirium tremens. And then there's the psychodynamic things where there's a mental illness like schizophrenia, where hallucinations will intrude into the conscious mind. Now, so you're talking about people that are very, very sick. And when I was reading these scholars, it struck me, and was very clear that they had never seen anyone in a chemical delirium as I have, or someone that was hallucinating from mental illness as I have seen. Because if they did, they would never hazard these kinds of explanations because they're so misguided. Somebody that's hallucinating from a biochemical derangement, those kind of hallucinations are not warm and fuzzy and, talking to your kind savior. They're hallucinations like snakes are crawling in your bed. There's an elephant in your room. There's scary stuff. The hallucinations and the mentally ill are often very morbid. Voices tell you to jump out the window, light yourself on fire, drink acid, those kinds of things that I've seen. So, to have just to kind of give a shotgun explanation and walk away is illogical. The other thing, maybe the most important thing, is that hallucinations are private experiences. They occur only in the milieu of the individual's brain. So any kind of group experience is inconsistent with any medical understanding of a hallucinatory phenomena. Now, there are group hallucinatory experiences. People used to call it mass hysteria. It's more commonly or better termed in modern parlance group sociogenic illness or group sociogenic phenomena. But those types of things, they're not common, but they can have visual components to them. But they're in a social context of excitement where people have a sense of expectation, and they're never the same from one person to the next. They may see something similar, but it's never precisely the same. As you would expect it to be, it's a private experience in the person's brain. That's inconsistent with the disciples who were in hiding. They were forlorn. They didn't believe the women telling them that Jesus had resurrected. It took some convincing, and as it would for anybody, because they saw him get killed. Luke chapter 23, I think. They all watched. John was close by, but everybody else was far off watching, and they saw him die a grisly death. I'm an American. I use the example of Abraham Lincoln in my book. There was a physician named Charles Leal, who was a new medical graduate, first year in practice, Union Army physician. he wanted to go to Ford's Theater because he wanted to watch Lincoln, because he had seen Lincoln, and Lincoln had they say, a facial palsy from being kicked by a horse when he was a youngster. So he was curious to watch him. So he was there and he was at the theater. Well, when something happened, he was the first person in the room. He found Lincoln without a pulse, without vital signs. He examined him. He took a blood clot out of the back of his head, put his left small finger in the bullet wound, did CPR, and got some vital signs back. And he held his hand for 9 hours until he died. There's a phenomenon where people rally just before the moment of death. And he said, it's called terminal lucidity. He wanted Lincoln to know that if he rallied at the moment of death, that he had a friend. And now, you may not know this, there was an effort to snatch Lincoln's body. This was some years later, I think in the 1780s, but it was bungled, and they never pulled it off. And then they redid Lincoln's tomb into something that would withstand a nuclear blast. At this point, there's no longer possible to snatch the body. But I pose the question: what if they snatched the body? Do you think Dr. Leal would think that he had resurrected? He had his finger in his brain. Do you think he would have thought Lincoln resurrected? Do you think someone watching a grisly death like Crucifixion, all of them watched, do you think they thought he resurrected? I mean, it just wasn't even part of Hebrew culture. They had a concept of the resurrection at the end of time, but nobody had an idea of a near-term resurrection. Jesus kept talking about it, and they never got it. They never believed it. So they weren't expecting it. They were in hiding. They were afraid for their lives. It doesn't fit the group dynamic to have what you might call mass hysteria. And of course, no psychological phenomenon can explain group encounters. And we see that, in the 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the first creed, where, where that Paul learned to creed, he didn't make it up, that they must have been part of their usual worship to recite that, I presume, that he was seen by 500 people at once. And as the creed was in those days, a lot of them are still alive, as if to beg the question, why don't you just go talk to them? So, it's the psychological things. Just when you look at a kind of a psychological understanding of them and what kind of things can cause hallucinations to occur, they really don't make sense.
Yeah, and I think the reason why we have to address the hallucination theory is because of all of the various theories that are out there. The hallucination theory is the one that is most popular, and certainly when it comes to critical scholarship, it's the one that they typically punt to. So it's good for Christians to know something about that in order to potentially deal with a response to that theory. I mean, at the end of the day, the critical scholars and everybody has to deal with the evidence that we have for the historic Christian faith, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, or the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And so I think that it's
the other natural explanations just don't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense to anybody. They went to the wrong tomb. Somebody snatched the body and they thought he had resurrected. They perpetrated a hoax. Those kind of things are bizarre to even contemplate. Some people will rush to the hallucination idea. But as I go through some explanation in the book, if you just won't even consider the idea that maybe God exists, and if God exists, then maybe an event could occur outside the bounds of natural chemical and physical laws, if you just won't even accept the possibility of that idea, then you're going to rush into these other explanations if you're going to think about it. But none of them are very good. And so you look at the what we use in medicine called the differential diagnosis logical tool, where we start looking at what diagnoses make sense and which ones don't, and we start to stratify and eliminate them. It becomes very difficult to consider any of the naturalistic explanations as being plausible.
Yes. I'll tell you what we'll do, Dr. Bergeron. We have another question here. We'll take this one as the closer for our session this evening. It seems that the hallucinations have sparked off a lot of thinking here. So I'll just read this question to you. Not quite sure it's from, I just have the question here. It says, indeed, there are different classes of hallucinations, but wouldn't post-death bereavement syndrome explain the appearances that the disciples were experiencing of their dead teacher? After all, they all abandoned him and failed to save him. They would have had sufficient guilt to induce this type of hallucination.
Visual experiences in bereavement do occur, but they're not common. The primary writer on that is a Welsh physician named Dewi Rees. In 1973, he wrote an observation article about hallucinations and widowhood. I think I said 1973, 72, 73. And it was really an important medical work because it talked about bereavement experiences. Yeah, my grandmother, for example, would tell me that she would hear my grandfather call her name at times, and those kind of things are common. Now, the most common one is a sense of closeness. Other sorts of things are less common. Auditory or visual things are less common, but they're not impossible. They primarily occur in the widowed spouse. They need to have had a good relationship, because if they didn't like each other, the likelihood of having such experiences drastically diminished. Visual experiences were uncommon, but they were brief and transitory. They were generally not tactile. And at no time, at least in Dewey's observation, which is the extensive writing about this in this context, these experiences don't convince the spouse that their husband or wife had resurrected. Now, Dr. Rees wrote an important article, and he identified himself as a Christian. His parents had been influenced by the Welsh revival. But he wrote a book later, not peer-reviewed, called Pointers to Eternity, where he postulates that these experiences have some sort of spiritual significance. They were actually spiritual and so forth. I think that's an overstretch for what those experiences are. They are known and verified experiences as part of bereavement. They occur, I think, primarily in what's called hypnagogic times, where at the interface of wakefulness and sleep. So they occur, but they don't make people believe the spouse resurrected. They're private experiences, and people generally don't even talk about them. Dr. Rees's study was important in the sense that he documented these things because people don't talk about them, and even in his study, they weren't discussed publicly and only disclosed in the context of his study. So to say that the disciples experienced bereavement-related visions would be inconsistent with the usual experience of a spouse. To have them be interactive, tactile, conversational would be inconsistent with the usual experience. To have them convince the person of resurrection would be inconsistent with the usual experience. So they just don't fit the category. And again, perhaps the most important thing is they're not group experiences. I think I lost you there.
Sorry, I haven't got my mute back on. Sorry, but thank you very much, Dr. Bergeron, for that response to the bereavement question. And we do appreciate you taking time out of your work. I can hear you are at work. I see you wearing your scrubs. I hear the phone going. And thanks so much for giving us a bit of your time to talk to us about this very interesting subject, Jesus' crucifixion, and the fallout after that, and the reactions. And it's a subject which I think Christians should take the time to study, to be prepared to answer the skeptics and to present the arguments and the case for the historic Christian faith. And thanks for all your work in the area, and please continue with that. And thank you for your support for Rasha Christi, and also we just hopefully would like to see you. Maybe you can come and visit us here in Africa in the future and come and be a part of the work here. We would love to have you come out and teach and lecture on these subjects. For us, maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to do that. So yeah, we'll keep praying for you. Thank you for your support and encouragement as well. And yes, do take care. To our speakers out there, please do remember to check out our website and to subscribe and to consider Rasha Christi and support us, please. Thank you for those who are doing that. And remember that next week we'll continue with our next session with Rogers from Uganda on traditional African religions and the prosperity gospel. And yes, good evening to you all, and thank you, Dr. Bergeron, once more for your contribution this afternoon.
That's good fun. Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
All right. Well, good night and God bless. Thanks, Andre. Take care, Joe.
Are we still on?
Yeah, we're still on.
But we're not on air.
We're waiting for Andre to wrap it up.